Okay, thank you. I believe we have all of the CPAC members back. Just triple checking. Chris, I saw Chris. All right. So we're going to enter the phase of discussing concretely some voting questions related to the report. That will give an opportunity for the CPAC to revisit the evidence both on comparative clinical effectiveness and value, other benefits and disadvantages, and contextual considerations will also be part of the discussion when we come to value votes. So what I'm going to do first is let Celia walk. Well, actually, we might as well do this part first. We're going to just go through the mechanisms, the voting machines that the council has, just to make sure that they're oriented, and then we'll start the discussion. So, Celia, do you want to walk them through that part?
Sure. So everyone should have a voting machine. The number on the machine should match the number on the back of your nameplate. If everyone will hold the on-off button down to turn it on, and it should bring up an ID, field for your ID. If you'll just enter your ID into the field and click Join, which is on the upper right. It says ready. Let's see. How about now? Yes. It still says ready. Let's see. What was that?
Numbers, IDs in the upper right.
Yeah.
And not all of them are right.
Yeah. Oh.
Yours isn't right?
We could use a little innovation in these voting machines. I know that.
Does,
Well, so does anybody have number one? I'm number one.
Oh, that's
Pardon
a
me?
good number for Yankee Swap.
Yes, we are.
But I've never figured out if
So I think they might be ready.
except for Rob, who has a different number.
What's the?
I have three.
Does anyone have a 1?
Anybody have a one? I'll trade you.
No, on the ID,
On the upper corner.
upper right.
That number should match your thing.
Let me get Chris on.
All right, so let's do a test run, and we've marked down for you that you are actually number 1/3 because we don't actually have a 3. All right. So we're gonna do a test vote to make sure everyone is all set up. Our test question right now is in the theme of March is approximately how many possible March Madness bracket combinations are there? And so if everyone will just enter your answer. The number isn't showing up there anymore.
Number what?
Like 9 out of 11, 10 out of 11.
Did you?
I did start it.
Oh, darn.
Excuse the technical difficulties. We're just.
Yeah, I am not entirely sure. I'd like for them to. Did they freeze it? They did. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
It'll just be 1 minute. My apologies.
Okay. So that's fine. I've never seen that before.
We just have to reboot the software. It'll just be 1 minute. All right, we have it back. So,
gonna get the tech guy to help.
So does everyone have, what does your screen say right now? All right, so here, now we're active. So if everyone will enter the user ID that is on the back of their nameplate and press join. Are we all set?
We want this to be showing on the screen. That part, yeah.
And we're going to move into a test vote in just 1 minute.
Thank
Oh,
you very much.
there we go.
That's perfect.
All right, so we have our test vote here. Does everyone have the numbers on your screen? Yep, so it should say A, B, C, D. All right, I see the votes coming in, meaning I believe it works now. All right. We have all 10 votes in. I'm going to... All right. The correct answer is 16.4 billion. See? So it was pretty equal across these, but this should be the correct answer. And now we will move on to our voting questions. I don't think so.
All right. All right.
Oh, I'm sorry. 9.2 quintillion is the. I'm sorry. I was stressed. All right.
All right. Can I move that off of the language, please? Put it way up in the right-hand corner. That's perfect. All right. Okay. Fun with technology. I think that's yours. All right. So first, before we obviously get close to a vote, we're going to reopen it up for discussion of the points of interest. But sometimes it helps to have a voting question in front of us to at least start to stimulate those specific thoughts. A very, very important part of the votes is to be as clear in your heads and in the discussion as we can be about the patient population and the comparators that are at issue for each vote, because they will change. At least the comparators will. The patient population for all the voting questions are patients age 18 and older with moderately to severely active rheumatoid arthritis and who have had inadequate response to or intolerance of conventional DMARDs. So this is not talking about any evidence about first-line treatment for patients when they're very first diagnosed. This is based on the evidence that exists in which patients have been largely studied after inadequate response to CDMARDs. All right. I hope this will change. Nope. Okay, as long as this, okay, good. Okay, so the first set of voting questions are going to be certainly on comparative clinical effectiveness, and we're going to be talking about votes related to their use as monotherapy. Now, I just want to get my set of tables. Here we go. Okay, so the first voting question, labeled number 2, because I guess the first voting question was the NCAA brackets, will be, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of tocilizumab monotherapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab monotherapy? monotherapy tocilizumab versus adalimumab. Now, the council, you will have the key tables from the evidence report in your little evidence summary. So again, you can walk through those, but you'll be able to see the evidence ratings in Table 2. You'll be able to see in Table 5, when we get to it, if you wish, those are kind of a shortened version showing each drug, monotherapy or combination therapy. You see the preliminary draft evidence-based medicine rating on the comparative clinical effectiveness from the report. And looks like strange things are happening here. But what I'd like to do is to open it up for your questions going back. And again, we've got at the front table, we've got the clinical experts, representatives from the patient community. We have Dan and John to answer questions about the ICER report and specifics. So as you start to think your way through this question, we should bring back up any questions or issues you wish to highlight as part of your thinking on this vote. Teresa.
Question. So on Table 2, we look at, with combination therapy, we look at etanercept versus adalimumab, and we give it a rating of a C. So they're comparable. And then for combination, right?
The question's about mono.
No. We're talking generally questions.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. And then if you look at Table 3 with cost effectiveness of just etanercept with DMARD or an etanercept monotherapy, cost effectiveness in the comparator column, we're showing that etanercept is cost effective, correct? And then, so my full question is, and then why do we drop it, that comparison in Table 5? The combination.
Okay.
So I can answer the last question first, which is that the focus of these voting questions is on the newer classes of agents. So we're not involving TNF inhibitor comparisons in our voting questions. So Table 5 is intended to inform the voting questions.
Okay, but I guess
The first question
I don't want
was
to create a
about
whatever here, but given that those two drugs are used a lot,
right.
why would we not talk about them in that light?
Sorry, the decision was made ago, and these were posted for public comment, and there was no vote on etanercept versus adalimumab that we envisioned.
In terms of the specifics on the clinical effectiveness, our draft rating versus the cost effectiveness results. So our draft rating is based on the available body of evidence, all of the clinical effectiveness results, any potential harms, the sort of an overall judgment. Cost effectiveness findings were driven by the point estimates from our analyses. And so, as John mentioned, in a deterministic way, the results appear to show cost-effective findings for etanercept, but I think it's also illustrative when he presented the cloud diagrams with the probabilistic results. That's where you saw lots of overlap in the estimates between any two treatments. I don't know if that clarifies things or not, but so overall gestalt on the clinical side for the evidence ratings, but the actual point estimates from the studies were used for each of the individual drugs, as is typical in modeling exercises.
Dan, do you want to just briefly summarize, again, you did this during your earlier presentation, but since this vote is specifically on tocilizumab monotherapy, what was the evidence base for that? There was a head-to-head study. Why don't you quickly
Right. So a
summarize
single
that?
head-to-head trial of tocilizumab and adalimumab. This trial results suggested superiority for tocilizumab in terms of disease activity and ACR response. No statistical differences in HAC results, and radiographic progression was not part of that trial.
Okay. And how long has it been out, and how does that relate to our knowledge about its harms compared to adalimumab?
So adalimumab was one of the first approved drugs in the late 90s, early 2000s. Tocilizumab has been on the market since 2012. So not quite as much history on the harms there.
Okay. Questions from the CPAC about your judgment of the evidence on tocilizumab versus adalimumab? I'll ask, were the patient populations, do you remember whether they were relatively similar in the studies that, well, duh, it was a head-to-head study. So the patient populations were relatively similar. Were they, is there anything specific about, just for, in terms of commenting on the generalizability of this comparison, were they in a particular kind of proportion of the kind of subpopulation? Was there any specific interest, okay, in certain kinds? Yes,
So,
Andrew.
not to cloud your vote in any way, so you're modeling on a group of patients who have moderate to severe RA, yet the patients in this trial had very, very active disease. Right? They had a CDAI of 44 on average, where active severe high disease activity would be 22 or greater. So we're talking, 16 swollen joints, 20 or more tender joints. This is not the typical patient that we see in practice, and again, points out some of the challenges as you go from clinical trials to the real world. The things that you talked about as being important that we look at, CDAI, SDAI, are actually in this trial a post hoc analysis, and they were neither a primary or secondary outcome. A large number of the patients were not. It's hard to do trials in the U.S., and a large number of these patients, were from outside the U.S., in Asia, South America. So the patient population is a bit different. You know that this is 8 milligrams per kilogram of tocilizumab rather than a lower dose. So I'm assuming, and again, it's never mentioned whether this is sub-Q or IV, since both forms are available. The adaptive trial was a comparator looking at the IV group. And the comparator, adalimumab, was at 40 milligrams every other week, yet some patients could go up to, in real world, go to weekly. So those are all things that we would think about as we're trying to weigh the evidence.
All right, thanks. Austin.
When ICER weighs the evidence and comes up with an evidence rating, do you consider whether it's a primary, secondary, or post hoc analysis? Is that factored in?
Dan?
Sorry, could you repeat that just quickly?
So Dr. Laster just reminded us that on this particular study, the outcomes that may have indicated superiority of
Disease activity.
tocilizumab, whatever, I'm not good with the names,
Yeah.
were a post hoc analysis.
There were other outcomes
Yeah.
that were primary, but in terms of the things that we often clinically look at, a number of them were not included in the trial either as
Okay,
primary
maybe
or secondary outcomes.
Most of these studies include multiple measures of disease activity. So there was I'm not sure which one it was, maybe the DAS. There was
And it was a change in the DAS. It wasn't, a change in DAS 28 over the length of the trial, 24 weeks.
right.
Okay,
So
I guess I just misunderstood.
If we were exclusively faced with looking at post hoc data only, we would take that into account for sure.
Okay, that answered it. Thank you.
Yes, Chris.
So I noted that there are oral formulations, sub-Q and IV, but I haven't heard anyone talk about convenience issues, and I just wanted to ask those with more experience in this therapy area, is convenience an issue?
Can we just hold that till we get to the value votes? So this one is, because that starts to take us to other benefits and contextual issues that are important. So let's hold that and consider this part just on the clinical data. All right, why don't we go ahead and vote then, please? There are now 11 voters. We'll be able to see when all 11 have entered their vote. Yes is that there is evidence that is adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of tocilizumab monotherapy is superior to adalimumab monotherapy. All right, I think it's going to pop up. No, maybe I just have to. Do I have to do it?
I can do it.
All right, go ahead.
I don't know if I can find it. I'm sorry. Yeah. No, it's not. No. Well,
Oh, there you go. Just drag it over.
yeah, but we're on the wrong question now.
Oh, okay. Well, then take it.
May I just have to announce the results? Apologies that the system is not working very well today.
Yeah.
So the, can you just
You
give me
can
back the results?
So
Yeah.
hit 3 again. Great.
There we go. Okay. All of this work to tell you that it was unanimous 11-0. And actually, you can see it. Probably should have just told you that. But if it's going to take this much time, I think I'm
Yeah.
just going to verbally describe the results. You'll have to take my word for it. Okay, let's keep going. We have a lot of clinical effectiveness questions to vote on. Okay, so now I need question 3. There we go. Okay, so now we are sticking in the same drug class. This is the emerging drug sarilumab. Again, you know where to find the information now in the evidence tables. The question is now, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of sarilumab monotherapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab monotherapy? Yes or no? Does anybody have any questions about the study on sarilumab? Dan, is there anything that you want to highlight to distinguish again?
So again, a single study of sarilumab monotherapy versus adalimumab monotherapy. This was adalimumab every 2 weeks, sarilumab 200 milligrams every 2 weeks comparison. Thanks to my team, I actually have the study in front of me. So as shown in the table that I presented, superiority on measures of disease activity in this particular case, both in terms of the mean change in the DAS28 ESR as well as in reported remission. So sarilumab 27% achieved remission versus 7% with adalimumab. ACR 20, 50, and 70 response were all statistically significantly in favor of sarilumab. And the change in the HAC, the mean change in HAC, also favored sarilumab statistically.
Shoot.
So I would have a little bit more confidence in this trial because the patients on adalimumab could go up at 16 weeks if they didn't have improvement to the 40 milligrams weekly. There are 2 doses, 150 and 200 milligrams of sarilumab, and I think they looked at the 200, which is kind of the anticipated dose. The other thing, again, 2 things to keep in mind is one, we have what we have. This is one trial. Typically, if you're doing comparisons, the FDA would like 2 trials before you could go any further, but there's just one here. And the other question to raise is really, what does IL-6 do in the body? If you actually look at the number of swollen joints, the swollen joint count between sarilumab and adalimumab was virtually identical. So is this an effect that IL-6 inhibition has on fatigue and other issues in terms of quality of life? Not in any way to minimize that, but if you're looking at improvement in terms of swollen joints, there's not much of a difference. But the other criteria that incorporate a patient global, that may drive this in terms of the improvement.
Thank you. Any other questions from the council? All right, let's please vote then. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of sarilumab monotherapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab monotherapy? All right. And you will, let's just assume again that it's 11, don't assume, it is 11 yes, 0 no. A unanimous vote. All right. So sticking with the theme that the voting questions are in the areas in which, in the classes, mechanisms of action where we are seeing new drugs approved in the near term. Question 4 is the evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between tocilizumab monotherapy and sarilumab monotherapy? Sorry, this is the same place. But now we've gone through two questions where you said 11-0 that their net health benefit was superior to adalimumab. Now we're saying, is there enough evidence to be able to distinguish between the two? Dan, do you want to highlight where in the tables or in your presentation this information would best be found?
Well, so I think you could look at either tables 2 or 5 in your packet. There were no head-to-head studies of sarilumab and tocilizumab, and the findings, as with all other comparisons between TIMs, the findings of our network meta-analysis suggested no statistical differences between the two.
Matt or Andrew, are there anything from the clinical expert perspective of comparing the evidence on these two drugs that you'd like to add at this stage? No? Okay. Panel or council, any questions? All right, please vote. Is the evidence adequate to distinguish between these two drugs as monotherapy? All right, hopefully your voting is open now. Okay, we have two people, I think, who are still thinking. Let us know, there we go, if you're having trouble with the machine. All right. Is anybody waiting to vote, just so we know? Okay. All right, we have, all right, another unanimous vote, 11 no, 0 yes. The evidence is not adequate to distinguish between the two as monotherapy. All right, we are now moving ahead to question 5, where we do change drug class. So we're now asking about tofacitinib. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of tofacitinib monotherapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab monotherapy? Dan, I'll invite you again if you want to highlight your thinking about the evidence base for tofacitinib.
So there were no studies, no head-to-head trials of tofacitinib monotherapy versus adalimumab monotherapy, and again, our network meta-analysis results were not statistically significant.
Okay. Any questions from the council? All right, please vote. All right. Sure. Sure, but let me just tell folks what the results were. So I'm sure they're waiting on tenterhooks here. So 11 no, 0 yes. So the evidence is not adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit of tofacitinib monotherapy is superior to adalimumab monotherapy. Matt.
Not adequate might mean there is evidence and it shows that there's no difference.
Mm-hmm.
Or there is an evidence, but it sucks, and I can't tell. I mean, and I don't know how you're going to, that has a motive implications when you finally write this.
Yes, we try to be very clear in terms of the inadequate evidence about whether there is evidence with which to make the judgment, and you can't tease two apart versus there's not enough evidence to really make a
Oh,
judgment.
so you define it in your
So-
document, but are the panelists voting like that too? You are, okay. Just wondering.
Lovely.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on.
The computer just died. I wonder if it's plugged in for power. Sorry, folks. You'll be able to get this up shortly.
I don't know.
Just shut down.
It just shut down.
Is it plugged in for power?
It should be. You pass that.
It's working.
Thank you.
Everybody keep looking at the screen because it's snowing outside. I'm sorry again.
Where does this go? All right.
It's beautiful.
Are we on tofacitinib?
Yes, we finished tofacitinib, so we're to the next one. Baricitinib, perfect. You good? Okay. We're back up online. Thanks, that was quick. I think it was just out of power. So, I hope that was the issue. All right, so. Oh, all the connections are lost for the voting. Should we?
So if you just enter your ID number again. There should be on the bottom right, you can enter resume. Searching for session. Are we back? Okay. We're just, yeah, I think we should close.
All right, back to, we're just getting the handbook.
Okay. Okay.
Just get me back to the slide I made. All right, we're going to go old school. So what we're going to do is you actually get to put those blasted things down, and we'll just have you raise your hands. And we'll just do a quick count, and then we'll kind of reflect it back for the audience on the webcast as well as Okay. That's lovely. I know. Snow is affecting everything. Yay. All right, we good?
Yeah,
All right.
but not with these clickers.
Right, right.
Unfortunately.
No, we're going to go with hands. It's all right, we can do that. Here, why don't you keep this one, though? Okay, so moving on to baricitinib. Again, we're going to vote with our hands this time. So just pause with your thinking, and then I'll ask for a vote when it looks like people are ready. So this is the question, again, about monotherapy. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of baricitinib monotherapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab monotherapy? Dan, help us again with whether there is a head-to-head, what the network meta-analysis showed, et cetera.
Right. No head-to-head trial of baricitinib monotherapy versus adalimumab monotherapy. Network meta-analysis showed no statistical differences.
Okay. Any questions from the council? Jason.
Dan, this was given a C plus. rating, right? Was it no significant difference? Was there a trend towards statistical significance?
We're talking about monotherapy here, so the C+
Sorry.
was for combination therapy.
Thank you very much.
Which will be coming up. All right. I'm going to assume that folks are ready to vote. So is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that it is superior baricitinib monotherapy to adalimumab monotherapy? May I see, raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. All those for no? Okay, 11 again, 11 to 0. All right. Okay, so this last question is similar to the question you had earlier. It is the evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between tofacitinib monotherapy and baricitinib monotherapy? Dan, I'm sure, again, you can say the same thing pretty much.
No studies comparing the two JAK inhibitors to each other, and no significant findings on the network meta-analysis.
Any questions? Okay. All those voting yes? All those voting no? 11 to nothing. Hopefully the score on Red Sox opening day in favor of the Red Sox. All right. Now we're going to move completely differently again to talk about comparative effectiveness of these drugs in combination with conventional DMARDs. So take a second just to reshift your eyes on the tables you've been looking at. Make sure that you feel oriented to the questions as they come up. Make sure that you feel free to ask questions to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. Question 8 here it is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of tocilizumab plus C-DMARD therapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab plus C-DMARD therapy? Dan, you're on again.
No head-to-head studies. No significant findings on network meta-analysis.
And please feel free to mention anything about harms, because I often feel like harms get short shrift for many reasons in our data here. But is there anything that should be noted about the knowledge of the evidence? Knowledge of evidence. Is there anything about the evidence on harms that should be noted?
Again, I think we talked about this with monotherapy as well. So adalimumab has a more long-standing track record in terms of safety. Tocilizumab was introduced in 2012. Similar profiles in terms of serious infection risk, et cetera.
Okay. Since we've entered C-DMARD combination therapy, anything from the patients or the clinical experts that they'd like to add? No? Okay. Andrew, did you?
Many patients are on combination therapy, although not all of them want to be on it. The IL-6 group is not a category where it's required that they go on methotrexate. So if you look at the label for infliximab as well as for rituximab and golimumab, methotrexate, the PI says it's to be combined with methotrexate. For adalimumab, you can do it or not. So there's no data, as you've indicated, a direct comparator, but if you voted that tocilizumab monotherapy was superior to adalimumab monotherapy, and you add methotrexate to both, again, data-free zone, we don't have that, but would you think that the same would hold?
Would you? Might you assume that methotrexate, the difference at least between methotrexate and, I'm not saying I do, yeah. I'm just saying I can see. Go ahead.
And again, it's hard to say on the individual patient level, but we know the trials would appear to indicate that adalimumab and methotrexate is more effective than adalimumab alone. Right. Does it make up the difference if you add, and people have looked at people who've been on methotrexate and then they went to tocilizumab, but that's, again, a different setting.
Okay. Any questions or comments from the council? Okay. Do you feel like you're comfortable where you are in the tables looking at the information? Dan summarized again the available evidence. But why don't we go ahead and vote then? We'll use hands again. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit of tocilizumab plus CD-MARD superior to that provided by adalimumab plus CD-MARD? Those voting yes? Those voting no? All right. I think we'll keep going given the number of questions we have. If we have time, we might circle back. The next question, we're going to run down a long line of combination therapies similar to the monotherapies. The next question is about sarilumab plus CD-MARB therapy. Is the net health benefit superior to that provided by adalimumab plus CD-MARD therapy? Dan?
No head-to-head studies, no significant findings in the network meta-analysis.
Dr. Snow, are you catching? Did you have a question? Okay. Yes, Chris.
No, I just wanted to know that this is net health benefit, not net benefit or cost effectiveness, right?
Correct.
So that's
Correct. All right. Let's go ahead and vote. All those voting yes? Those voting no? All right. 11. The next question. I'm not even sure we need to do this question at this point, but we'll go ahead and keep it in. Is the evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between tocilizumab plus CD-MARD therapy and sarilumab plus CD-MARD therapy? Sarilumab still not FDA approved, so we will assume that there have been no head-to-head trials. Dan, go ahead.
No head-to-head trials, no statistical differences in the NMA.
Got it. Okay. All right. If there are questions or comments, please make sure you let me know. Otherwise, all those voting yes? All those voting no? Okay. We have a unanimous vote no, 11-0. Question 11. Moving on to the IBS from the MABs. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that this net health benefit of tofacitinib plus CD-MARD therapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab plus CD-MARD therapy? Dan?
So this is tofacitinib, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so there was one head-to-head trial, 717 patients, trial that actually compared tofacitinib, adalimumab, and placebo, all with background methotrexate. Comparison between tofacitinib and adalimumab yielded no statistical differences in disease activity, ACR response, or HAC, and radiographic progression was not studied. In our NMA, no statistical differences.
Any comments from the clinical experts, the patients? Counsel, any questions? All right. All those who believe the answer is yes. Those voting no. Okay. Again, 11-0. The evidence is not adequate to demonstrate net health benefit of tofacitinib is superior to that of adalimumab in combination therapy. Next question is about baricitinib. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of baricitinib plus CD-MARD therapy is superior to that provided by adalimumab plus CD-MARD therapy? Dan, might as well.
So a single head-to-head trial in a little over 1,300 patients of baricitinib, adalimumab, and placebo in this population. The findings suggested a statistically significant improvement in disease activity, ACR response, and HAC in the comparison of baricitinib with adalimumab. And as I described when I presented the evidence review, results were relatively modest from a clinical perspective. So the example I gave was ACR 20 or better response, 74% for baricitinib arm, 66% for the adalimumab arm.
Okay. So here we do have a head-to-head trial. Questions? Austin.
I would be interested to hear from our clinical experts on the clinical significance of that type of difference?
So the trial is called RA-BEAM, and it's challenging because there are things that appear to improve. There were differences between baricitinib and adalimumab and others where there was not. So ACR20 responses at 52 weeks, there appeared to be a difference. The DAS28-CRP was different. The HAQ-DI was different. But in terms of the remission, it wasn't statistically significant if you're looking at remission criteria based on an SDI, which is another measure of disease activity. So it wasn't uniform. The differences were small and were found in certain metrics, but not others.
Just want to verify, too, there was also a finding that there was improvement in both pain and fatigue reported by patients as well, correct? Page 44.
Correct. The HAQ-DI favored baricitinib.
Right, but there's also VAS pain and as well as a measure of fatigue in addition, also in favor of baricitinib.
Any other questions? Comments? Yes, please.
Just to mention your comment about harms again, is that this is a drug that's currently...
Sorry, could you please just make sure to pull...
currently under study and under review, not FDA approved yet. And the devil is in the details. And for patients, it's about the devil that we know versus the devil that we don't know. And often these new drugs come with risk evaluation and mitigation strategies that will reveal potential harms that aren't quite apparent yet that are revealed in random clinical trials.
So not knowing what, I mean, baricitinib is also a JAK inhibitor, but a different type. It inhibits JAK1 and JAK2, maybe part of JAK3, and that's a bit different than tofacitinib that's already out there, Xeljanz, which is a JAK2 and 3 inhibitor. In personal experience, it's a very attractive drug for many people. Again, we'll talk about that later in terms of that as a pill form. But with that, I found comes a underappreciation of the fact that you're on an immune modulator. People think that a pill is safer than a sub-Q or an IV dose. And in part because of that, but maybe because of the drug, risk for infection in the JAK inhibitors, in my practice, appears to be a bit higher than some of the other biologics in kind of, and again, you know that herpes zoster occurs more commonly in immunocompromised patients, but is a bit more common, at least in the trials, for tofacitinib, although perhaps not for baricitinib.
Other questions or perspectives? All right. You guys all feel like you're looking at the right information and you've heard what you need to hear. Let's go ahead and take our vote. So again, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of baricitinib plus CD-MARD therapy is superior to that of adalimumab plus CD-MARD? Those voting yes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those voting no? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Let's take a second to pit stop and debrief on that, just to hear, so we can include in our report some of the different perspectives that led into your votes. Someone who voted yes, want to comment on what led them to say so? Yes, Jean.
I was not impressed with the evidence, but there was some. And given all we have heard today and in our clinical expert reviews about the necessity to have more options, some evidence made a difference to me.
All right. Other perspectives from those who voted yes that you would feel should be part of the record, if you will? There was a large contingent of yeses over there. That's why I'm looking at you guys. Anything else you wanted to add?
I would just add, I was just impressed with the number of measures on which there were some clinically significant differences. And that's why I raised the question about pain and fatigue, because I think we were in a situation where you said, well, there are two measures on which there were differences. There was one which there were not. But it seems to me that there was a range of different outcomes which were affected favorably by this.
Okay. Teresa, did you want to add something or no?
So I voted no.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's shift to the no's. Go ahead.
I think you raised the issue on the no difference with some of the clinical remission, which to me is very important, more so than perhaps even the ACR for me in practice. And then the uncertainty around just that it's not onto market yet.
Right. Other no's? People want to add or reinforce some of the points made? Stacey?
I was kind of torn on this one and went back and forth, and I voted no for similar reasons and also just because of the unknown long-term effects. So.
All right. Good. Other comments that people wish to add? Please.
I mean, your comments, Dr. Fama, I mean, it again underscores the challenge we have as rheumatologist clinicians looking at trial data. And we'll get to this in the roundtable, but ACR 20/50/70s are important in a trial, but really it doesn't give you a feel for where the patient is at one point in time. It's a comparator. So if in this trial you have a patient who has 20 swollen joints and you get an ACR 50, which by any measure would be very effective, and they come in with 10 swollen joints rather than 20, in our mind, that's really, we're not doing our job, and we haven't gotten people to, treat to target low disease activity or remission.
Great, thank you. All right, one last question on clinical effectiveness, and this one actually may create some logical questions for you, because now we're asking you to look back at your thoughts on tofacitinib and baricitinib in combination with CDMARDs, and vote whether the evidence is adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between them. Dan?
No head-to-head studies of the two, and no significant findings on the network meta-analyses.
Tricky because obviously some people voted that the evidence was adequate to say that it was better than adalimumab, whereas they said no for tofacitinib. But again, that raises the question of whether there is enough evidence with which to make a solid judgment, more than whether...
I can see you're enjoying this, Steve.
No, I'm not really. Now, we create these logical pit holes to follow into, so I have to smile out of that if I don't. Any questions about this particular question? Part of the reason these questions are tough is because they're framed, obviously, when there's an emerging drug, that's where a lot of initial thinking and questioning goes in about how it compares to other drugs, especially drugs in the same class. So it's very challenging, especially when they're just before FDA approval, but that's where we are.
You could look at the trials and you say, well, here's one trial here and here's another trial, but you have to appreciate that the enrollment criteria might be different, the baseline characteristics might be different, and so we really don't want to get drawn into this idea that we can look at the remission rate or the ACR 20, 50, and 70 from one trial with another and think that they're comparable.
Point. All right, so let's go ahead and vote. Is the evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit between tofacitinib plus CDMARDs and baricitinib plus CDMARDs? Those voting yes? Those voting no? All right. 11 no's, 0 yes. All right, based on the clinical effectiveness votes, there will be a single value vote. And this is it. Because we don't take value votes when the evidence isn't adequate to demonstrate clinical effectiveness, superior clinical effectiveness. In this case, the vote was yes. So, right, but we don't have a price. And we're not going to be taking value votes on the drugs for which we do not have a market price yet. So that's why, even though Serlimab also was a yes, we're not going to be voting on its value. We don't have a price. So for tocilizumab, let me just read the question first. Given the available evidence on comparative effectiveness and incremental cost effectiveness, and considering other benefits, disadvantages, and contextual considerations, what is the long-term value for money for tocilizumab monotherapy in comparison to adalimumab monotherapy? So I recognize that this may be viewed as a relatively small quadrant of the universe for the treatment of RA patients, but this is the point at which we want to step back and think again, what are the other potential benefits or disadvantages of these therapies in comparison to each other, adalimumab here versus tocilizumab? Any other contextual considerations you feel should be thought of as part of your judgment for long-term value for money? John, would you like to summarize the evidence that we've presented on this?
So in the summary table 5, you'll see that we're in the monotherapy first part of that table, and we're looking at tocilizumab versus adalimumab. Again, the long-term cost-effectiveness finding there is that tocilizumab, on average, was less costly, and tocilizumab was more effective than adalimumab. So that's that second row in the monotherapy area of table 5.
Now, do we need to contextualize this a bit with, you brought up the issue of whether the intravenous costing, at least for some payers at least, could be undercounting the payer markup. So is that something that we would want to stipulate as part of the consideration here, or at least note that the value that they're seeing for cost effectiveness does not reflect potential provider markup?
Yeah, I think that's important to consider, that our analysis didn't include any facility-related markups of IV therapies.
Right.
We used the Medicare fee schedule estimates in producing a cost for IV administration.
Okay. Rob?
So we know that it's less costly, and we voted that it is more effective, but what would you recommend as a metric to guide the determination of, is it intermediate value or high value?
I want to speak carefully because we usually don't want to guide you too much on this, because usually it's a tougher question. Unless you, I wanted to raise the issue about the costing just to make sure that was at least a footnote to this vote. But usually when we're talking about long-term value for money, the incremental cost effectiveness piece, we're talking about increased cost and some increased benefit, and we're trying to make a judgment about the relative amounts. Here, the model suggests that it is overall less costly and slightly more effective.
So right, but what I'm drawing from table 3 is that we have an incremental cost difference per quality of about $60,000 to $63,000. If you compare tocilizumab to the comparator.
Not sure where you're looking.
Okay, we
John,
actually don't have the information you're looking for, because you're comparing two incremental cost effectiveness
Yes.
ratios. Really what you'd want is a slide that we had in the morning's presentation on the total payer costs. Oh, you have that slide in front of you? Okay. Okay, so I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Okay. So my bad. But no, if you're referring to the total payer cost of the two agents in monotherapy, that would be an appropriate way to look at the difference in total cost over the lifetime.
So the question too is, because tocilizumab comes in two forms, IV and sub-Q, there's a potential benefit in a therapy that patients can take at home, and they don't have to come into the clinic or the hospital for that. There is no data that we've looked at regarding the sub-Q form. The dosing can vary from every other week to weekly, so that's, I think, another challenge.
In the model, both IV and sub-Q were judged to be less costly and more effective.
Right. And again, if real world, with patients on adalimumab, with 10% of them actually taking it weekly, that could even further increase the cost difference between the two.
Right. Yes, Jean.
Thinking, Dr. Laster, about your presentation on and these crazy incentives and disincentives depending on payers. So the facility fee for an IV administration would be covered by Medicare, but perhaps there would be other disincentives with a private payer. Is that correct? So I'm thinking about the cost in our other contextual considerations, cost to patients.
And it varies whether we're talking about a Medicare patient or a commercial insurer, where, for Medicare, the Part B health benefit would be covered either in the office or in the hospital. And it depends on whether you're talking about getting an infusion in the hospital or a clinic, where the hospital cost could be 3 to 5-fold higher than they would be in a clinic. And again, maybe we'll talk about it in the roundtable, but the ability for rheumatologists to care for their patients, where they're just down the hall in an infusion center where the nurse says, hey, Mrs. Jones has a cough, could you take a look, is very different than a patient just going to the hospital and getting their infusion, where they're removed from any direct care.
I think there's also an issue around patient preference, which I have to point out, and we hear from our patients that some would like to be infused, that they don't feel comfortable injecting themselves, or some would like to inject or find a way to get their treatment once a month. And so all of that plays as well in terms of having a need to have these drugs accessible to all of the population.
And from a safety point of view, that comes into play as well. We tell all of our patients about the risk for infection and not to take the drug if you think you might have an infection. But even bright, intelligent patients benefit from these drugs, so much so that they often don't want to tell you that they have an infection. And repeatedly in our infusion center, we've had people come in with a cellulitis and their leg bandaged, and the nurse asks them, do you have an infection or a problem? And they will deny it because they want their drug. I worry even more in some individuals like that, where there might be a compliance problem if they're out on their own taking the drug without any type of interface with a healthcare provider.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was pointed out to me that because this voting question focuses on monotherapy, which is where our vote was earlier, that there is actually only data on IV tocilizumab versus adalimumab. So to whatever extent it matters, I think we will make good note of the questions about provider markup, but this is specifically about an IV comparison. Any other comments or questions from the council? All right, let's go ahead and take our vote. It's going to have to be a 3-part vote. I'll start A, B, and C. So we're talking again about the value, long-term value for money, including your considerations of the other benefits and disadvantages and contextual considerations. All those who would like to vote low, intermediate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and high, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 high value, 5 intermediate value. All right, and briefly again, so we can segue to the policy roundtable pretty soon, but the intermediate value votes, this was something that on paper was listed as being less costly and more effective. Intermediate value?
So our calculations over here suggested that it's about $75,000 for 0.4 qualities. So seems like that is an intermediate value if we project that out to a full quality, about $170,000 by our calculations.
But just to make sure, it's $75,000 in savings.
Savings.
Yes.
And we're costing less and we're improving health more.
Yes.
Okay. So it's considered a therapy that's sort of a win-win.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
So in that way, we generally don't compute an incremental cost-effectiveness ratio because we're saving money and we're improving health.
So the question is, though, is that constitute a high value, though, for such a small gain? That was my question.
Okay. I think that's a fair point to at least note.
But
that you were concerned about the health gain being relatively small?
Yes.
Okay, but I just want to make 100% clear that you are saving money while getting that benefit. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go from 6 to 5 to 7 to 4 in favor of high value. Any other quick statement about intermediate value?
I guess from my experience with my hospital with IVs, I'm just very, I understand the discussion that we had behind trying to come up with the IV costs, but I'm still very skeptical that that's adequately reflecting what's being the health system cost.
Okay. In the future, we may try to, it's hard to gather data on that because it just varies so widely, but we may be able to figure out a way to provide you some either scenarios where we're clear about whether maybe one vote if it's the provider markup is X or less, and another vote if it's more than that, something like that. Because I appreciate that that's tricky, especially for those of you who have clinical experience and have seen some of the difference in the costs that can come from provider markup. Okay, but the final vote will be 7 to 4 with some rich commentary about some of the reasons and the thinking going into it. So that is it for the votes. We are now going to shift into the part of our day when we're going to talk about how we translate this evidence into future research, into thoughts about coverage and pricing, into thoughts about clinical practice and patient engagement in a way that can improve the situation. So we're going to invite up a couple of additional folks to help us with that discussion. Thank you. And why don't you come on up and I'll introduce you as soon as I get your bios. I know there's just one I need some help with. Here we go. I got it. Well, actually, do you mind just so Tom and Andreas? Who else we've got? I guess